Hey, Dickheads! We've got a special pink laser beam of truth that beamed from two places on the globe to your brain hole. It came from New York City and San Diego. We interviewed Sam J. Miller, who is the author of Blackfish City, which you may remember as a Dick-like suggestion from episode 15, the Vulcan's Hammer episode, where I suggested Blackfish City as your Dick-like suggestion. He's been nominated for a shit ton of awards, including the James Tiptree Award, the Nebula Award this year for Blackfish City, but he's also won the Shirley Jackson Award and the Andre Norton Award for Best Young Adult Novel. That's a long way of saying he's a goddamn good writer. So we're really excited to have him here today. We're going to talk about his books, also PKD. We're going to nerd out about what we think PKD would be doing these days. So there's plenty of time in this interview to stretch out your dickhead muscles and learn about somebody new. So enjoy the interview. All right, Dickheads, joining us tonight is Sam Miller, author of Blackfish City, recently nominated for the Nebula. You've already gotten his bio, so let's jump right in. Sam, welcome to the Dickheads podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, your book, Blackfish City, was absolutely one of my top reads of last year, and we will get to that. And don't worry, Dickheads, we're going to nerd out about Philip K. Dick if you stick around with us long enough. We're going to get there, but I wanted to kind of introduce Sam and where he came from. So where did you grow up, Sam, and how did you discover science fiction?
I grew up in a pretty depressed economically small town in upstate New York called Hudson, which is near Albany. And I was the last in a long line of butchers. My father and his father had a butcher shop that went belly up when Walmart came to town. I, like a lot of nerds, spent a lot of time in the library. Ray Bradbury was my first real science fiction obsession. I remember reading a lot of the Golden Age science fiction writers like Asimov and Heinlein and kind of bouncing off of it in a way that I didn't with Bradbury. There was like a beauty to his writing in addition to a great storytelling and plotting to his work. So that was my real sort of like beginning of love for science fiction. And the science fiction family tree is really, really weird and has a lot of strange branches and roots. And I think William Burroughs is a writer who often isn't considered a science fiction writer, but I think is sort of like, especially if you're looking at the new wave of science fiction, a sort of important progenitor. So I remember reading Naked Lunch when I was a teenager because it was Kurt Cobain's favorite book, and being like horrified by it because it's extremely graphic and there's some really horrific scenes, but also like fascinated by it, and I kept coming back to it in spite of or because of its horror.
Well, and you also have some experience with punk rock, which is the culture that I came out of. Sci-fi, and I got into sci-fi when I was younger, but then punk rock together, and I think it was always kind of the whole outsider thing. So definitely I want to hear a little bit about your experience. I know you were in some punk bands, and what was your experience with punk rock?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I was a really angry teenager. I was really isolated, and I was dealing with a lot of, I went to a school with a lot of jocks, and I was not a jock, and I went to a school with no out gay people, and I was a gay person. So I was dealing with a lot of bullying, and I was just generally miserable and unhappy, and I met some really hot punk rock boys, but the hotness was like, just beside the point. But yeah, I mean, it was the first time that I heard something that really echoed the sort of like shriek that was lodged in their throat. So like hearing the Dead Kennedys, hearing Minor Threat, I think that that really did something to me. But it also, there was like a political level too, because, like I said, Walmart came to town and put my family butcher shop out of business, made my whole family unemployed. And so at the same time as I was socially angry, I was also angry at like big corporations moving in and big, wanting to look at things from like a lens of what is independent, what is about community and building. And so that always appealed to me punk rock. And it was just a space for people who were angry to be angry together and to make something beautiful.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, I believe your first book was The Art of Starving. What was The Art of Starving about?
The Art of Starving is about a small town bullied gay boy with an eating disorder who believes that starving himself awakens latent supernatural abilities, and he uses those abilities to work on a quest to find out why his sister ran away from home.
Wow. Yeah, it has been on my list. I have not read it yet, to be honest, but I love the concept. So obviously that's a deeply personal book. That obviously was probably really intense personal experience for writing your first novel. Is that the first one you wrote or the first one you published?
No, it was my debut novel, but also the seventh novel that I wrote, because I wrote 6 before that nobody wanted. Although I tried my damnedest to sell them on every street corner and knock on every window and door and ring every phone that I could. But yeah, no, it was, the advice they tell you is, tell the story that only you can tell. But I felt like the story that only I could tell was so messed up and weird and dark and fucked up that no one would ever want to publish it. So I spent many years trying not to write The Art of Starving. But when I did, I got a great agent and sold it really quickly. So it is true. In my experience and in the experience of some of my writer friends who are among the best, awesomest folks out there, it's best to go where your dark, twisted heart is, rather than where you think the market wants you to be. So yeah, there's a lot of me in that book. There's a lot of punk rock in that book. It's very much about finding yourself, and that you can. The gloss in that, I think, is that I say is that when you're young and you're angry, violence can give you power. There's a power that comes from violence, and that's it's not a productive power. The real power that we need to find is the power that comes from loving yourself and accepting yourself and knowing who you are and standing firmly in it. So that's the sort of journey of that novel.
Yeah, it sounds really good. So, did okay? So you went to Clarion. I saw. Did you go in San Diego or in Seattle? And who were your teachers at Clarion?
I went to Clarion UCSD in 2012. My instructors were Jeff Ford, Delia Sherman, Ted Chang, Walter John Williams, Holly Black, and Cassandra Clare.
Whoa! Yeah, that's quite a lineup. So that's how you know about biking around San Diego, right?
No, I wasn't a biker then. I
really?
Came back for the book tour for Art of Starving, at which point I'd been converted into much more of a hardcore biker, and I borrowed a friend's bike and went all over town and had a really great time biking in San Diego. But yeah, no, that was a real powerhouse lineup of instructors. And in fact, I had heard about Clarion for years. I was a heavy Boing Boing leader, and Cory Doctorow, who's one of the editors at Boing Boing, would always talk about Clarion. So I knew that it existed, but it wasn't until I saw that Ted Chang was one of the instructors that I said, oh, I have to apply to this. Because Story of Your Life gets my vote for the greatest science fiction story ever written.
Yeah, it's great. We're both Ted Chang fans here at Dickheads. And yeah, I mean, Clarion, I think, so I think you would probably credit, I mean, you said you had several novels written before you went to Clarion. Do you credit Clarion with helping you make the jump to finish Art of Starving in a level that was ready to be published? Or, I mean, it's got to be such an amazing experience to translate some of the works that you'd already been working on. from Clarion.
Sure. No, I absolutely credit Clarion with helping me make like a real quantum leap forward in my writing and in my publishing. more importantly, and I think some of it, I think that you go in there thinking that it is the instructors like, oh, Ted Chiang is teaching. I really want to learn from Ted Chiang. And you go in there thinking the instructors are where you're going to get the most, and you do get a lot out of that. But for me, uh, it was more about the collectivity of it and the fact that it's you and 17 other writers, all of whom are at an early stage in their career, really helping each other improve and really, I don't know if either of you if you're Legend of Korra fans, but before I got on the plane to go to Clarion, I saw the finale of season 1 of Legend of Korra, and maybe I missed my plane because it messed me up because it's a really good episode. And at the end, one of the characters says to Korra, "When you reach your lowest point is when you're capable of the greatest change." And so Clarion was really about me sort of like realizing, or sort of a little bit getting out of my head of thinking I'm so great, and really being able to like benefit from collectivity and workshopping and learning from other folks. As a writer, you have to be able to hold two contradictory truths in your mind, right? You have to believe on the one hand that you're good and that your work is good and you are worth asking other people to read it, but you also have to hold the complete opposite, which is that you're not that great and you can always get better. You should always be learning and trying to read and find folks to help make you better.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely great advice. I think trusted readers are certainly underrated as far as like having the reader. I know I've got this guy sitting right next to me is the guy that I know will tell me something's bullshit in my books if I need to hear it. Yeah, I mean that having that friend who's willing to call you out on your shit is really important. So, Sam, you're one of the things that drew me to. So I first discovered your existence from listening to your many appearances on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And shout out to Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. I've done many times on this show. One of my favorite podcasts, and you've been on there many times commenting on things ranging from xenomorphs to, I don't know, but you always bring some kind of class consciousness or some kind of political bent that myself, as somebody who's got 20 years of activism, in my history, always appreciated. So when you mentioned Blackfish City and all the elements that were going on that we're going to eventually talk about, that was a no-brainer for me. I looked it up at the library, saw they had it, immediately got it. And, I just want to talk about where did Blackfish City come from? How long have you been gestating it? And I know Art of Starving has a lot of your personal politics in it, but Blackfish City has a real global outlook. So can we give people a little introduction to the book and where it came from?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Blackfish City is set in a floating city in the Arctic after rising sea levels have transformed the globe and opening up the Arctic to resource exploitation. So the Arctic is sort of like a boom town, and this is a floating city that's been constructed for refugees from the sunken world, and into this hotbed of awesomeness and horror arrives a woman with a killer whale and a polar bear by her side on a mission that is eventually and visually explained. So as for where it came from, I mean, I have a lot of strongly held beliefs, and I've been doing community organizing for over 15 years, and I've been, it's always been really important to me to sort of look at things like class and race and gender and oppression and how how conflict shapes societies and our lives. So yeah, most of my books or stories, you're gonna find a healthy dose of some real heavy shit for want of a more technical term. And so, this book really, the sort of seed of it comes from my feelings about cities and having lived in New York City for like 18 years and having done community organizing in a city and therefore having spent way more time than most people would want to in terms of like meeting with elected officials and researching how laws and policies happen and trying to look at why we have the problems that we have and what we can do to fix them. And so this is my wanting to look at a city, to imagine a city that is unencumbered by history, right? Any kind of city, wherever you are, you have to grapple with its history. You can't understand New York City without understanding, the history of American racism and everything from the Civil War draft riots to the sort of immigration side to whatever. So imagining a city that's free from history, where some problems can be solved. For example, a lot of the work that I do in New York is around police reform. And there are cities in the world that function just fine without a really racist military police force. New York City is not one of them.
Right.
New York City is a city where we have like this really aggressive police force that behave a complete lack of accountability and aggression and hostility towards lots of communities, including people of color. So wanting to imagine, like, let's say there's a city where that isn't the case, or a city where there's abundant geothermal energy so that we don't have to worry about things like heating or fuel or electricity or solving our energy problems. So what problems can be solved, but also what problems can't be solved? Like, what problems will persist, right? We'll still probably have slumlords trying to gouge prices and make people homeless and keep housing off the market to keep the supply low and the demand high. So, some problems can be solved, others cannot. But this is my sort of like utopian dystopia look at a future city.
Yeah, and so one of the things that you answered one of my questions, which was, why a totally fictional city, and I definitely get what you're saying about how it takes away like the historical aspect, but you put so much work into the world building. I'm interested in one of the strengths of this novel for me is that the city, and you told me how to pronounce it before we started recording, but it's Quanok or
I pronounce it Quanok. I had K.
Okay,
but
yeah, and so this city seems very fully realized, very well researched, in my opinion. It feels lived in, kind of like when you see like the dirt on the starships and Star Wars. I really felt that it was very lived in. Did you kind of outline or plan the city? Did you make maps? Did you do any of those kinds of things when you were writing this book?
Well, I did make it pretty easy on myself because the shape of the city is, because it's a floating city that was constructed completely. It didn't have to worry about geography or topology. I could just say it's an 8-armed asterisk with, 8 arms, all of equal length, 10 kilometers. So it's just a big star floating in the ocean. But then also thinking about like how, what's true of every city, right? There's neighborhoods. There's the place where the working class lives. There's the place where the very poor live. There's the place where the rich live, and those neighborhoods shift and change over time. And the population of those neighborhoods changes. So really trying to map a lot of what I've come to know about cities and how what makes them amazing. Into this sort of vessel that was like a blank canvas to be filled. Because, even the things that I think, people cite when, I've heard people call it dystopian, which I don't, fully agree with. But, even a lot of the things that people would point to as negative, I think are positive, right? The fact that you have, street art right? There's a lot of graffiti. It's something that a lot of people associate with disorder and crime and ugliness, but that is actually really beautiful, I think, and makes a city special and is a canvas for folks to feel ownership of their city. Um, so yeah, adding a lot of that, the many ways in which people make a city their own, even if the city is, even if they don't own anything, right? Even if there's just a tenant who's struggling to pay rent, they have just as much ownership of the city as anyone else.
So the characters are really strong in Blackfish City, and I think the representation, it doesn't seem forced, but you have definitely a lot of diverse characters, including characters with gender fluidity. And I'll admit, like early in the book, there were times where I got a little confused. But what was great is that for me is that the longer I read the book, the characters became to life and became very much a part of the city. And I'm wondering, did you have a lot of the characters in mind? Are you a pantser or an outliner? With like, how did this process happen in the writing with the characters?
Yeah, I mean, I often have it, at any given moment, I've got like hundreds of thousands of story particles bouncing around in my head, and sometimes they're really small. Like, wouldn't it be cool if there was a lady who had a killer whale for her best friend? Or what if there was a floating city in the Arctic? And sometimes those will start to bounce off each other. So sometimes a story or novel will start with characters. Sometimes it'll start with a fictional, like a superpower or a speculative conceit. Uh, this one really started with the Orcromancer, and with this woman who arrives in town with a killer whale. And so yeah, I think I tend to let these things percolate until I have a lot in place. I don't always do like a very rigorous outline in terms of like, here's everything that's going to happen in the book. But I generally don't start until I have a lot of pieces. Like I know that there's going to be, these people, and this is their ultimate. This is where the plot is going to end up. And how we get there, I'm not always sure, but some of it I'll outline as I go. So I'm, like one pant on, one pant leg off, half pantser, half outliner.
Right. So what's cool about this book for me is that I think if you're gonna just throw out like subgenre labels, I mean, obviously this book can live just as science fiction, but in the kind of subgenres, there's a lot of cyberpunk influence. There's a neo noir kind of thing going on. There's like the whole world building with the city, but most importantly, I think right now because it's a really important subgenre as far as the warning novel and the subgenre of cli-fi. Did the addressing climate change? It sounds like it kind of came natural once you created the character of the Orcamancer, and uh, I am I wrong? Is that did the climate change aspects of it kind of come naturally after the creation of that character, or just out of the seeds of that character?
I think it was always going to be in the mix. If I'm thinking about the future, I can't not be thinking about that. One of the things that is central to my work as a community organizer, and one of the most frustrating parts, is getting people to care about things that they don't care about.
Right.
Is looking at things like homeless people and saying, actually, that's not that guy's problem that he's homeless. It's our problem, and it's if you're struggling to pay your rent in an expensive city like New York,
Or
you
San
actually have a
Diego.
lot more in common, or San Diego, or San Francisco, or Los Angeles, or Boston, or Chicago, right? We're all impacted by the high cost of housing. It's in all of our interests to fight for a city where people can afford to live and not, break their backs working incredible hours for crummy pay. That's a lot of my fiction is a different mode of that same struggle. Here in New York, I've been working for years on a campaign around landlords who keep vacant property off the market so they can artificially inflate the cost of housing. And it's been, very slow. No one cares about it. People don't see it as a problem. So I was like, okay, I'll do it in the future and add robots and killer whales and polar bears, and then people will care about it. So it's the same way with with issues of climate change and looking at the fact that how many people are either, um, you know, openly hostile to the idea and reject it and say it's not real, or almost as bad, if not worse, in a different way, is people who are just like, it's going to happen. What am I going to do? So wanting to really tell a story that foregrounds the power that we have and the power that we have as individuals, but also as members of communities to do something about the problems that we face.
All right, so I kind of lied about one thing before we start. I do have one really intense note that I pulled out of the book.
Please.
Yeah, and I really, of course, being an anti-capitalist myself, I really loved how this book addresses capitalism in many instances and many times. But my favorite quote from the book, and I highlighted this in my review on my blog too. There's a quote. I have no idea what page it's on, but it's quote: "Money is a mind, the oldest artificial intelligence. Its prime directives are simple. Its programming endlessly creative. Humans obey it unthinkingly, with cheerful uh,
Alacrity.
alacrity. Yeah, you know what I'm sorry. Like a virus, it doesn't care if it kills its host. It will simply flow onto someone new." Man, I love that quote. I pulled that right out of the book. And, for all my reviews, can you tell me a little bit about, like, some of the ideas that you got there? I love the idea of money being the oldest artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I remember very clearly the genesis of that concept, which was many years ago. It was actually in 2011. And we did a protest where, as part of this campaign around landlords keeping property empty, we did a takeover of a vacant lot that was owned by Chase Bank. And we like took down the chain link fence and built a tent city. And it wasn't like intended to like be a place where people would live. We wanted to do like a performance art slash, basically reclaim the space for as long as we could hold it. And like we had like a fashion show and we fed people and we had like spoken word poetry and just really trying to show like how much a community can do with a space that is currently being viewed as a vacant lot or like an asset on a spreadsheet somewhere.
Yeah.
And when we realized that, the cops showed up, they arrested a bunch of us. We had to put pressure on Chase to get them to drop the charges. Nobody at Chase knew they had this lot. There was no human who had ever made that purchase, right? It had been acquired by, Lord knows who. For so many people who are wealthy, whether they're stockbrokers or real estate developers or whoever, they don't deal in concretes. They're dealing in really abstract concepts and making purchases that don't mean anything to them. And so really it's almost like we are the parasites on the backs of the resources, whether they're money or land or whatever. So really feeling like we are incidental and in many cases controlled by money, and that money dictates what we do with it. And so most of the time when you look at things like why landlords charge so much rent, they don't have a choice. They of course they could choose to lower their rents, but it is the dictates of money. Money demands to be multiplied. Money demands to make more of itself, and that's what they're obeying.
Right, and what I thought was kind of neat in that moment was, I had this feeling of like, no matter how different or futuristic or weird the city was, it comes down to the same issues I'm dealing with paying my rent, those kinds of things. I thought that was kind of neat. Blackfish City, the reaction has been great. I'm really pleased to see all the time, like the fact that it got nominated for the Nebula, all that. Personally, it should win the PKD award this year, and we'll get to that later when we talk about PKD. If I was a voter on that, it'd be shooing with me. But what's the reaction to Blackfish City, and how has it been for you seeing now that this brain baby is out in the world?
Oh, it's been phenomenal. I mean, I am, I've been publishing short fiction for a while, and the thing about short fiction is it's it's a very cozy world. You know, you publish a short story in a science fiction outlet like Clark's World or Lightspeed, and it will be read by other science fiction writers. And you'll have great conversations with people, and you know, we're all colleagues, we're all friends, we all really, you know, we don't all love everything we do, but you know, you'll find your crew of the folks who are doing stuff that's like you. But with a novel, like actual humans read novels, right? There's, you know, there's obviously authors read and write and critique novels, but the fact that you get conversations happening, you know, way beyond the community of folks who read, critique, and talk about and love short fiction. So it's been pretty crazy to sort of go to this new place where suddenly, you know, I was just before this, I was doing a book club visit with a bookstore in Puerto Rico that read the book, and their book club was discussing it, and we did a Skype visit with them. So yeah, it's been crazy. You know, I mean, one thing is that like it's kind of like a drug. So you know, you get a few tweets about your book, and you know, you're really happy, but then you get used to that, and then a day goes by without one, and you're like, no one loves me, my baby is forgotten. So you know, it's like any kind of attention. It's easy to get your head turned by it, but it's wonderful, and you know, you know, you write weird, twisted books like this, and you hope that it'll find folks who love it, and you do it pretty sure you're not going to be a New York Times bestseller if you're using they them pronouns, but you do it because there's going to be folks who will connect with it, and whether that's, you know, 5 or 20 or whatever, it's amazing.
Right. I love the book, and I hope Dickheads out there will check out this book, because I do feel that, you know, we recently did a whole podcast about Norman Spinrad's Journal of the Plague Years, which was his take on HIV and the whole AIDS crisis, and we talked a lot about how we were kind of bummed that we didn't get to see PKD address this issue, because we just, you know, he could have done such amazing things with it. And I think all the time about, like, how would Philip K. Dick translate the climate change world? He did a lot about the nuclear issues in the 50s. And we're really entrenched right now in the early PKD, because that's what we've been doing on the podcast. But, you know, like, for example, Second Variety is such a nuclear threat book. And I would love to know, or get talk about what do you think PKD would be doing to address climate change? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I love most about Philip K. Dick is that, not that he's the only one who did this, but I think he did it in a way that really transformed science fiction, which is that he wasn't writing about the rocket ship captain or the, you know, the president. He was writing about the android, or the cop, or the drug addict, or the, the people who had not historically been centered, often the, you know, very marginalized folks. One of my favorite things about the Man in the High Castle, which I don't know if I reread it now, how much I would still like this, but I remember reading it and being really impressed with the extent of humanity and complexity that the Japanese characters, who ostensibly would have been the villain in most, I think, narrations of that storyline, were given. So, you know, I think that kind of radical decentering of where power normally lies would incline Philip K. Dick to be much more interested in, like, what does the climate refugee who's, you know, discovered a new drug in the ruins of a fallen city have to say about climate change than the president who is denying that it's a problem. You know, I think that he would have some really interesting takes on it, and would bring us up close and give us a real close-up look of some aspects of climate change that we might not have thought about, in a way that I think would help people, you know, get it in ways that they might not be now.
Well, you know, we always find, because, you know, we listen to a lot of his interviews, and we chop them up for bits on the show, and you know, we recently interviewed a historian who was really taken aback by comparing these two different quotes from PKD in different eras. And one of the things that I think gives him a strength, and I know it's a strength I don't have because I have very definite political views. And what's cool about PKD is that he was such a provocateur in so many ways that there were times where he would take a position and you'd just be like, what? Because he already said this, and his characters would do all kinds of different things, and it was clear that he had a liberal or a progressive viewpoint overall, but he certainly had no problem, like you said, with the Japanese characters in Man in the High Castle, exploring ideas that were not necessarily his own. I don't know if you noticed that in his work too.
Yeah, I think so. And what the limited bit that I know about him as a person is that he had, his ideas shifted. He, was whatever issues he had, where he could be like, in his personal life, be very good friends with Thomas Dish, and then write a letter to the FBI denouncing him, saying that his novels had secret signals for cells, communist sleeper cells. So yeah, there's a chimeric nature to him that I think would probably give us some unanticipated or surprising takes on whatever subject he addressed, including climate change.
So, what was your gateway drug to Philip K. Dick? How did you discover Philip K. Dick?
I think that it was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep.
Like all of us, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's the poser answer, but it is the answer.
That's the same for both of us. So
okay, good.
Yeah.
I think that I was never. I love Blade Runner on many levels, but Blade Runner is not one of my all-time favorite movies. The way that I know that some people are passionately, intensely in love with it, and actually, it took me a while. It took me several viewings over many years to really see what it was doing that was so special. So I didn't come to it from the oh my god, this movie is so good perspective. I don't remember how I did come to it, except that it was shortly after I had moved to New York City, and I was reading a lot of. It'd be fascinating to try to connect the dots to how I got there, but it was in the context of reading a lot about New York City. It might have even been Thomas Dish. It might have even been something of his.
Mm-hmm. So, do you have personal favorites from PKD? What's your favorite part of his catalog?
Well, Do Androids Dream really does hold up. I reread it not too long ago, expecting it to be pulpy and shittily written, and it's a beautifully written book that I think really holds its own. The Man in the High Castle, I think, is really special. I think The Man in the High Castle might be my favorite because I feel like it's making the kind of conceptual leap and really meta special thing that only the very best speculative fiction does. And so the sort of end place of the book is it just gives you the kind of shiver that only a really smart ending can give you.
Well, and what's really interesting too about Man in the High Castle is it's sandwiched between Vulcan's Hammer and Game Players of Titan in his catalog, which is really weird because you got these total. I mean, I like them, but comparatively to Man in the High Castle, they're crap fest pulp novels that have their, the things I like about them. However, Man in the High Castle is such a weird book to be kind of in between those two. And I personally like that he lives in both those worlds of the pulp and the more higher class sci-fi.
Yeah, and a lot of his short fiction, I think, inhabits pulp in a really brilliant way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the thing about and of course, we like to nerd out about different things in PKD, and we always like to look and I know we already talked a little bit about how we do climate change, but I'm wondering if you give us your perspective on how did PKD change the genre from your perspective?
I mean, I think that he, like I mentioned, I think that there's part of a really radical decentering of power in his work that is, not unique to him, and was part of, I think, a conversation that a lot of the sort of like so-called new wave of science fiction writers were doing. But I think he brought it, helped in a way that no one else did, really help bring it down to the sort of grit and street level of like, a dope fiend shivering, as opposed to like man of power wrestling with a difficult decision. So, I think that is important. I think that there is like a prophetic quality to him, uh, not only in the sense of like, he's anticipating things that are going to come true in really interesting ways, um, but but there's a prophetic quality in that he's sort of like naming the future of science fiction before it is the future of science fiction. So I think that like, Man in the High Castle and Blue Android's Dream are sort of like really like that you said, uh, High Castle is out of place within his own body of work, but it's also out of place within like where the genre would go. So it's always hard to chart influence, and I think that he is definitely inhabiting a space that like Samuel Delaney was also inhabiting, and so I think that it isn't in isolation, but I think it's an important part of a really big shift in science fiction that has sort of paved the way for what we have today. Thomas Dish being another one where you have gay writers, black writers, folks who were really trying to take the genre in new directions in ways that I think have are really happening in exciting ways right now.
Yeah, it was really interesting to us too when we were researching Man in the High Castle. It won the Hugo, but man, some of the editors that PKD worked with during his pulp years, they hated the shit out of that book, and they talked mad shit on it in the months leading up to it winning when it was just nominated, and it was crazy to me to see like like Don Wollheim, who was his editor at Ace, like saying that it wasn't science fiction, that it was trash, and all this stuff. And it's hard to believe looking back now that that was the reaction to Man in the High Castle.
Yeah, no, I think that's always an interesting boundary to be policed, right? When people start saying something isn't science fiction, or calling into question its genre credentials, it's often because it's doing something new and it's not doing something that they particularly like. And why is that? Why don't you like what it's doing? I think that you had that a lot with a lot of the women writers and women of color writers specifically who in recent years have really like been doing the most amazing and important and exciting and best writing, and how many people were just like, oh, that's not real, like that's a diversity hire, or that's that doesn't have merit.
Yeah.
What they mean is it's not doing what I want it to do, and what you want it to do is often something that's problematic or reveals more about your own biases than anything else.
Yeah. So just to kind of start wrapping things up, who are some of the underrated, diverse voices that you think the genre is missing from your perspective? I know I've got a few that I've been singing the praises of on my blog and on the podcast, but I'm really interested from your perspective. Who are we missing out on?
It's tough to say because often I feel like I have a very hard time assessing what you know people outside my circle of friends who I geek out with are really saying. So often I will think I will think that everybody already knows who Alyssa Wong is and is already loving her fiction, and then find out that people will not. So
yeah,
Malik.
I had that experience at the PKD Film Fest. I was talking to somebody about Nadia Okafor, and I just assumed that they knew who she was, and I was kind of just really bummed that they had no idea about the Binti trilogy, and I was just like, no, man, you got to go read that. It's so good.
Yeah, I mean, N.K. Jemisin just won the Hugo for Best Novel 3 years in a row, so I can't I can't imagine there's too many genre fans who are not at least aware of her. But I think there are a lot of folks who have held off on reading her for problematic reasons. But she's to me the most exciting writer in science fiction and fantasy today. You know, Mel El Motar, Seth Dickinson, Max Broadstone, Brooke Bolander, Laura Elena Donnelly, um, Elia Dawn Johnson. I could go on and on. There's a ton of great writers who are doing great stuff. Who, unless they're millionaires, more people need to know about them, even if they are well known. They're not well known enough unless they're New York Times bestsellers.
All right, so we got to do our part to help you get on the number one slot on the bestseller list because you get that Dickheads bump.
Yeah.
Obviously, well, okay, but you got another book coming out, and I've read a little bit about it. I'm super excited about it. Can you tell us about Destroy All Monsters?
Sure. Destroy All Monsters is my second young adult novel being published with Harper Teen, and it's about it's two stories, right? One is sort of a gritty contemporary set in the real world about a teenage girl named Ash, whose best friend Solomon is cycling into really extreme mental illness, and she's trying to save him. But it's also the story of a boy named Solomon who lives in a city full of dinosaurs and magic, whose best friend Ash is the refugee princess, and she's in danger, and he's trying to save her. So it's these two stories. One is set in our world, and one is set in a fantasy world, and they start to, we go back and forth between them until they start to morph into one and to influence each other as their two quests. The quests of Ash and Solomon in both worlds become revealed to be just one quest.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, in the meantime, because it doesn't come out for a couple months, everybody here needs to read. Everybody listening right now, watching at home on YouTube, whatever, gotta go out and get Blackfish City because shit is real. I absolutely loved it. So, just one last thing on Blackfish City. That one of the aspects of the neo noir, the cyberpunk aspect, I think, gets a little bit overlooked because the cli-fi thing. People are really attached to that. What's your cyberpunk influence, and can you talk about those aspects of this book? Because I did kind of forget to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I know it's what everybody says, but like William Gibson is one of my favorite writers. I think that William Gibson brings like a degree of, you know, most of what he does is really on point in terms of plot, in terms of his imagination and how gritty and real and live the world is. But also, the thing that I love the most is his characters have a ton of heart. It's something people don't always like include in the list of reasons why they love him. But I always sort of fall into these characters and their weird quests and their damage because they're really alive in a really compelling way, and that's something that I, you know, and would love to be able to equal and certainly striving to get there in stuff like Blackfish City.
Well, yeah, and I see that influence, but I would also say one of the things that is a strength. I mean, I love Gibson, but I think some of his stuff is a little inaccessible for the average reader. But what I think is really cool about Blackfish City is I think it's a very accessible book as well. I think it's not just for genre readers. I think definitely people who, the mainstream. This is an airport book. It should be anyways. This is one that I think could get out to a wider audience, and the message is so important. And by message, I mean there's many messages to this book. It's not just a single finger pointed at the reader. I think there's a kaleidoscope of interesting ideas about ranging from capitalism, how the structure of the cities work, to history, to the social political, all of it. And sci-fi, I love it. So, any last things you want to leave our dickheads with?
No, just that I'm really grateful to you all for reading my book and taking the time to talk to me about it. And I am honored and excited to be sort of like in a conversation, however posthumously, with Philip K. Dick.
Well, yeah, I think you earned it. I'm so bummed this book is not winning the PKD award, but it has a chance to win the Nebula, and that's so awesome. So everybody get out and support that book, Blackfish City. And thank you, Sam Miller, for joining Dickheads. Keep it paranoid. That's stay paranoid. Keep it paranoid.